Into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating, highly contrarian thesis about human physiology. We're looking at the work of Dr. Muguryilmaz and his piece titled Hypertensionomania. This source material completely challenges the modern medical consensus on blood pressure, arguing that almost everything we have been conditioned to believe about it might be a massive misunderstanding of how our bodies actually work. I'll be your guide as we break down his arguments. So, right off the bat, think about this. Is high blood pressure actually a disease? According to the source material we're exploring today, the answer is a resounding no. The author argues that in humans, and indeed all living mammals, high blood pressure is not a disease at all, but rather a vital, life-saving physiological response. To unpack this massive paradigm shift, we'll quickly move through 6 key areas: the blood pressure obsession, rethinking the circulatory system, the brain's demand, the kidney connection, the real cost of lowering pressure, and finally, the author's final warning. All right, starting with part 1, the blood pressure obsession. According to Dr. Yilmaz, modern society has literally been conditioned to live in absolute fear of their blood pressure. I mean, think about it. So many households have a dedicated plastic bag just stuffed with daily medications: blood pressure pills, blood thinners, stomach protectors, the whole shebang. The author points out that we've become a society that obsessively measures our blood pressure at home at the very first sign of a headache or feeling tired, totally terrified that our blood vessels are going to just explode from the pressure. The source even argues that the terminology itself is kind of weaponized. Just the word hypertension is designed to scare you. When you combine hyper and tension, it instantly creates this mental image of your veins acting like overpressurized boiler pipes, just waiting to blow. It paints a picture of this imminent mechanical failure. But, as we're going to see, the author believes this whole mechanical analogy is fundamentally flawed. Which brings us to part 2, rethinking the circulatory system. We are traditionally taught to think of the circulatory system like a municipal water pump or your home's heating pipes, right? The idea is that the heart does all the pushing through smooth, passive tubes, but the author presents a totally different biological reality. The text notes that while you can measure pressure in large arteries right after the heart, that pressure eventually drops all the way down to 0 in the venules, and there isn't some central heart down there pumping blood back up. Instead, the blood vessels themselves act as active organs. They literally have a middle muscle layer. So when the heart rests between beats, pressure doesn't just plummet to 0 everywhere, because those muscular vessel walls actively contract in a wave-like motion to keep propelling the blood forward. And the source highlights exactly why this distinction is absolutely crucial. Get this, there are roughly 100,000 miles of blood vessels in the human body. That's long enough to wrap around the circumference of the Earth 2.5 times. And importantly, the main arterial system makes up only a third of that. The vast majority of this massive network is actually made up of millions of microscopic capillaries and veins. So think about the physics here. If the heart actually functioned like an industrial mechanical compressor, trying to push liquid 100,000 miles through passive tubes using sheer pressure alone, it would require a massively destructive force. The normal pressure generated by the heart simply wouldn't be enough to push blood through millions of tiny capillaries. And if the heart somehow did generate enough pure pressure to passively shove blood that far, the author argues your blood vessels would just instantly inflate like balloons and tear wide open. To further prove that high pressure inherently doesn't just burst organic vessels, the author brings up the giraffe. A giraffe has a massive blood pressure of 350 millimeters of mercury, which it completely needs to fight gravity and get blood all the way up to its brain. Yet, a giraffe doesn't suffer from exploding arteries. The biological system adapts perfectly to the exact pressure it needs to survive. Let's look at how this applies to our most vital organ in part 3, the brain's demand. The author explains that blood pressure is primarily regulated by this tiny 3-millimeter biological sensor called the glomus caroticum, which sits right at the fork of your carotid artery. This incredible little organ acts like a constant monitor, checking the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in your blood. Its one overriding priority, making absolutely sure the brain gets enough oxygen. If it senses the brain is starving, this sensor demands higher blood pressure to force more oxygen upwards. So why exactly does the body intentionally increase pressure? Well, when you run or exercise, your muscles demand more oxygen, so pressure naturally goes up. But more crucially, as you age, your blood vessels naturally lose their elasticity and get stiffer, or they might develop narrow spots. To push blood through these stiffer, narrower pathways, the body literally has to raise the blood pressure. If it doesn't, the brain won't get enough oxygen. The author strongly warns that this lack of oxygen leads to ischemia, cell death, and eventually severe dementia and forgetfulness. So high blood pressure in the elderly, he argues, is actually a vital protective shield keeping the brain alive. And the brain isn't the only organ doing this. That brings us to part 4, the kidney connection. The body also uses something called the RAAS chain reaction. If your blood pressure drops too low, your kidneys don't get enough oxygen, which would literally cause kidney tissue to die off. To stop this from happening, the kidneys instantly detect the low blood flow and secrete a hormone called renin. This triggers a chemical cascade that aggressively narrows the blood vessels all across the body, forcing the blood pressure back up. Essentially, your body is chemically demanding higher pressure to prevent total kidney failure. This leads us to a really critical question in part 5, the cost of lowering pressure. Dr. Yilmaz makes a really striking comparison here. He argues that forcibly taking blood pressure medication is kind of like suffocating the body's respiratory system while it's desperately trying to deliver oxygen. Think about a runner finishing a sprint. They are gasping, needing to breathe deeply. Restricting their ability to forcefully exhale and take a massive breath would be completely absurd, right? Well, the author claims that artificially lowering blood pressure when your body is actively demanding more oxygen delivery is just as illogical. The author warns that the real-world costs of this artificial lowering are incredibly severe. He points out that while certain drugs relax the vessels and others weaken the heart's pumping strength, doing this in the elderly causes chemically induced circulation loss. This directly leads to syncope, which is sudden fainting when you stand up or try to walk. And those falls, they lead to devastating head traumas, hip fractures, and broken bones. On top of that, by forcing the pressure down, he argues we are actually starving vital organs of blood, causing ischemic memory loss and chronic tissue hypoxia. To back up his point, the source points to shifting medical guidelines, noting that the official threshold for what constitutes high blood pressure was lowered from 140/90 back in 2003 all the way down to 130/80 in 2017. The author highlights this to support his claim that arbitrarily lowering the threshold doesn't actually reflect biological reality at all. It simply turns millions of otherwise perfectly healthy people into lifelong medical consumers who are prescribed drugs they don't actually need. Which brings us to our final section, the author's final warning. Dr. Yilmaz really doesn't mince words here, stating that modern medicine has basically become an unquestionable religious dogma. He goes as far as labeling the systemic prescribing of these drugs as medical fraud. He argues the whole practice is built on unproven assumptions rather than actual fluid dynamics or physiology. In his view, simply questioning the necessity of blood pressure medication is treated like total blasphemy, despite all the physiological evidence he points to. He finishes by asking us to entirely rethink how we view heart attacks and strokes. The source asserts that brain bleeds aren't caused by high pressure blowing out a healthy vein, but rather by tissue decay or aneurysms that have already weakened the vessel wall. Heart attacks, he argues, are caused by blood clots, not high pressure. In fact, he notes that high blood pressure makes your blood flow faster, which actively prevents blood from coagulating and clotting. Ironically, he asserts that the blood thinners we often take alongside blood pressure meds are exactly what can trigger severe, uncontrollable brain bleeding. Which leaves us with this really provocative final thought. Are we just medicating the body's warning signs instead of actually trusting its built-in survival mechanisms? If Dr. Yilmaz's radical analysis is correct, the numbers we've been taught to fear might actually be our body's brilliant, desperate attempts to keep us alive. It's a fascinating perspective that for sure asks us to look at those daily pills in a completely different light. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.